Hi, I'm Louise, and I'm going to be 34 this year. After finishing college, I got a job at a big company that many people know about. They paid me a good amount of money, especially for someone new to the job. But it meant I had to travel a lot for work and often had to do extra hours, even on holidays. It was tough, but I liked feeling like I was doing something important. When I was 28, I got promoted to be in charge of a whole department, which was pretty cool, especially since it's not common for women to move up that quickly. About 4 years ago, I got married to my boyfriend, Brian. We'd been together for 2 years after meeting through a friend. I wasn't really thinking about getting into a relationship, but my friend thought it was a good idea to introduce us. I never really imagined myself getting married or having kids, but Brian was really keen on it. He said he wanted to get married soon and have kids before we got too old. I wasn't ready for that at all. I had just gotten promoted, and the idea of getting married and having kids felt too rushed. So whenever Brian brought it up, I told him we needed more time to know each other better, and that marriage meant thinking about more than just the two of us. Brian then suggested, okay, let's wait 2 years before getting married. By then, we'll really know each other, right? At first, I didn't think we'd last that long. But surprisingly, we did end up dating for 2 years before tying the knot. Throughout our relationship, Brian was loyal, didn't have any gambling habits, and always treated me kindly and sincerely. I admired his strong work ethic and how he always put effort into everything he did. But there was one thing that bothered me a bit: his big ego. Whenever someone at work, especially a senior, pointed out his mistakes, he'd come home ranting about how he didn't need to be told what to do and that he always thought his way was the best. Listening to him, it was obvious that he was being criticized for his errors, but it seemed like he couldn't handle being corrected, whether it came from a superior or not. When we decided to have a dinner with both our families to celebrate, Brian chose a really expensive restaurant that cost over $200 per person. He then asked me to split the bill with him because it was so pricey. I suggested going somewhere cheaper, but Brian insisted, saying it was important to make a good impression. I felt frustrated because it seemed like he was worried people would think he was cheap if we went somewhere less fancy. I thought to myself, if he's worried about that, he should pay for it all himself. But Brian explained that his salary couldn't cover the whole bill for 8 people, maybe just 3 at most. So he asked me to cover the remaining 5, meaning I had to pay more than half. It didn't seem fair to me, especially since we were both bringing 4 people from each of our families, totaling 8. Brian wanted us to go to a restaurant that's expensive, but he couldn't even cover his own family's part of the bill. I wasn't happy when Brian suggested the expensive dinner plan, and I was even more confused when he announced to everyone at the dinner that he would pay for everything. Although I had doubts, everyone seemed pleased, so I decided to go along with it and let him take charge. But looking back, I think I might have made a mistake. I regret not reconsidering my marriage to Brian, who was so full of himself. After we got married, his behavior towards me changed completely. He started talking down to me all the time. Before we tied the knot, he promised to help with household chores since I was busy with work. But once we were married, he said things like, "What will people think if they see a man doing laundry? That's a woman's job. I work hard outside, so I deserve to relax at home." He never lifted a finger to help, no matter how busy I was. His attitude annoyed me, but I could handle doing the housework. What really bothered me was that Brian was sending all his money to his parents. Even though they were farmers and struggling to make ends meet, it seemed like Brian was their sole financial support. Within 6 months of getting married, he stopped contributing any money to our household expenses and gave everything to his parents. I once told Brian, it's not fair for me to cover all our living expenses with my salary alone. But he argued back, saying, "How can you say that when my family needs help? They're your family too. Plus, you make more money than me, so you should be fine." He didn't listen to my concerns. When he talked to his parents on the phone, he'd reassure them, saying, "Don't worry, I'm taking care of everything with my salary. I won't let Louise interfere." But the truth was, he was giving them all his money. He had nothing left for himself and started asking me for pocket money, saying, "Can you give me about $200? I can't even afford lunch." I reached a breaking point and suggested, let's set a monthly limit on how much we send to your parents. You need to figure out how to cover your own expenses. Brian would agree, but he kept sending all his salary to his parents. That was something I couldn't tolerate anymore. One day, I had to go on a business trip for about 2 weeks. From Brian, I have what? What about my food and laundry for 2 weeks? Even though Brian knew my job required frequent travel. Feeling annoyed at his immaturity, I told him, figure it out yourself. You're an adult. If you can't handle it, why don't you go stay with your parents while I'm away? You'll be fine there, right? Brian reluctantly agreed. When I returned home 2 weeks later, I found Brian's sister, Elizabeth, there. She lived a bit far from us, and we hadn't seen each other since our wedding. I wondered why she was there, and Elizabeth, seeing my expression, said, "Hi Louise, it's been a while." "Oh right, about the money. It was a big help, thank you so much." She smiled brightly, saying things that didn't make sense to me. Without even unpacking, I asked Elizabeth, "What money? What are you talking about?" She replied without hesitation, "Huh. Brian said that since you had some savings, he'd give me money for my business startup. He'd assured me not to worry because you had at least $1 million. I was completely baffled. Just then, Brian walked in, holding my bank passbook and seal. When he saw my expression, he said, "Oh, welcome back. Perfect timing. I'm going to give your savings to Elizabeth. You know she's a nail artist, right? She's been wanting to open her own shop. She's been saving up, but she's still short about $1 million. I remembered that you've had savings since before we were married, exactly $1 million. So I told her she could have it." With a smile, he handed the passbook and seal to Elizabeth, saying, "You're lucky. This will help make your dream come true. Show some gratitude, okay?" I couldn't hold back anymore. I snapped. "What are you talking about? That's my money. Why are you deciding this on your own? I could understand if you said you lend it. We'd need a legal agreement and a plan to pay it back, right? You can't just give away someone else's savings without any discussion." I grabbed the passbook and seal back from Elizabeth. Brian looked at me and said, "What? We're family, aren't we? It's silly to make legal agreements with family members. Plus, we're not lending it, we're giving it. You never spend any of your money because you're always working, right? It's a waste to just hoard it. Elizabeth has a dream. Isn't it more meaningful to use it to help her?" Then he gave me a stern look. Upon hearing Brian's words, I realized that he was impossible to reason with. I felt like continuing the conversation was pointless. But then Brian dropped a bombshell. "This money is too good for you, so I'm giving it to Elizabeth. You'd only waste it. You can just work and save up again, understand? If you still want to argue, we'll get divorced." Seeing this as an opportunity, an idea struck me. Without hesitation, I replied, "Fine, let's get a divorce. I'll prepare the papers and send them to you. I'll come collect my things soon. Until the divorce is final, I'll stay at a hotel. Goodbye for now." With that, I grabbed my luggage from the business trip and swiftly left the house. Brian was shocked by my sudden decision. Soon after, he bombarded me with texts, begging me to come back and even saying that Elizabeth would forgive me if I gave her the money. I ignored all his messages. Who does he think he is? The next day, I went to the city hall and sent the signed divorce papers back home. Despite this, Brian kept texting me, asking if I was really sure about the divorce. I simply replied, "Please submit them as soon as possible," and ignored the rest of his messages. Surprisingly, the divorce was finalized quicker than I had anticipated. A week after the divorce was official, I waited until Brian was at work and then moved my belongings to my new house. In his text about the divorce papers, Brian had been rude, calling me names and saying we were now strangers. So I decided not to take most of the furniture and appliances from our old home. Instead, I deposited half of the small savings I had accumulated during our marriage into his bank accounts and left it there. That night, I received numerous calls from both Brian and Elizabeth. At first, I ignored them, knowing what they were about. But eventually, I answered and Brian immediately started shouting, demanding to know why there was only $800 in the account. I calmly replied, "I split the property as we agreed. We originally had $1,600 in our joint account, right? So I left you with half of it, which is $800. And since all the furniture and appliances were bought after we got married, I left them behind." That's fair, isn't it? Just to clarify, I ended up with less than Brian. But he wasn't convinced. He insisted, "You're supposed to have $1 million in savings, right? So half of that, $500,000, should be mine." Plus, you got an inheritance from your grandfather, right? Half of that should be mine too. I was stunned and couldn't help but laugh. I had seen this coming, otherwise Brian wouldn't have agreed to the divorce so easily. Trying to hold back my laughter, I explained, Brian, the division of property only applies to assets acquired during the marriage. My savings from before we were married and the inheritance I received aren't part of that. I consulted a lawyer and I divided our marital assets fairly. And remember, all the money we saved during our marriage was actually earned by me. You never contributed to our expenses. So be thankful I divided that. Brian accused me of lying, saying that can't be true. You're trying to trick me. Give me what's rightfully mine or I'll sue you. He yelled desperately, but I remained calm and replied, if you want to sue me, go ahead. I've been fair and I haven't deceived you. I'm not afraid of being sued. Hearing this, Brian panicked and said, wait, let's forget the divorce. I was wrong. Please come back to me. He completely changed his tune and begged for reconciliation. I responded firmly, the divorce is finalized and I have no intention of reconsidering. This is serious. Then I informed him, if you plan on staying in our old place, you'll have to cover the rent yourself. It's about $1,800 per month, which you probably didn't realize because you've never paid it. Brian weakly admitted, I can't afford that. If he can't pay, then it's his problem. After that, it seems Brian moved back in with his parents because he couldn't afford the rent. Unable to cover the moving costs, Brian sold the furniture and appliances I left behind. His parents thought Brian was making good money and welcomed him back, thinking it would make their lives easier. But without my income, Brian couldn't support them as much as before. And it seems he's struggling to adjust to living there. It seems Elizabeth's plans for her business were affected since she couldn't access any of my savings. She had to stop her preparations, causing her a lot of frustration. Brian also faced difficulties from Elizabeth, but that's not my concern anymore. I'm concentrating on my work and enjoying living independently. I've had my fill of marriage. Brian still sends messages, expressing his desire to reconcile. But I ignore them completely. It's almost amusing to hear him update me on his situation from time to time, so I've let it slide. However, I'm planning to